March 22nd, 1965. One of the most famous jazz musicians in America, Louis Armstrong, and his band of all-stars performed in Soviet-controlled East Berlin. The astonished audience watched in silence as the true sound of American culture penetrated through. Ambassador Satch had successfully made the case for American culture in the Soviet Union, a major victory for Western democracy. Armstrong was not the only artist to make his way behind the Iron Curtain. He was part of an extensive project much broader than this one instance, a global political and musical novelty. This was jazz diplomacy, America's musical stand against communism. August 6, 1945, the United States was about to unveil possibly the most destructive piece of equipment known to man that would solidify its place as the most powerful nation in the world. The use of the atomic bomb on two Japanese cities gave physical testament to U.S. technological superiority and embodied the true might of the American-made arsenal. Following the end of World War II, relations between the Allied powers, particularly the United States and the Soviet Union, turned sour, as Soviet activity in Eastern Europe and Asia raised fears of an anti-democratic takeover. Europe was divided between the two powerhouses, each half under the influence of differing economic and political ideology. Socio-economic and ideological debates began to take form as pressures grew. In 1955, tensions once again mounted with the Soviet developments of the hydrogen bomb, as both countries now possessed nuclear technology that rivaled one another and put the world at risk of nuclear terror. The Eastern Bloc, under the watch of the Soviet Union and its puppets, was formally cut off from the West, with ideological homogeneity maintained by propaganda and intimidation. The United States government, looking to gain influence and leverage against the Soviet Union, decided it was cultural appeal that would best improve the country's image abroad and promote American ideals. Soviet stories of American hypocrisy, as well as the USSR's recruitment of African-American industrial workers in the 1930s, became the driving factors of America's cultural appeal, as the U.S. looked to reverse its legacy regarding racial issues. Then-President Eisenhower in 1954 sent cultural groups abroad under the Emergency Fund for International Affairs, and in 1956 Congress set forth its official diplomatic vision under the International Cultural Exchange and Trade Fair Act. Though these policies did represent the official U.S. adoption of cultural appeal in Cold War negotiations with the Soviet Union, they served more as guiding principle in theory rather than they did concrete programming. Still relatively unexplored as a means of negotiation was music. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, cultural and musical expression in the Soviet Union was severely repressed. State censorship prohibited the Soviet people from being exposed to Western music and culture. Following Stalin's death, Premier Nikita Khrushchev welcomed many forms of art and music during a period of de-Stalinization from 1953 to 1964, now termed the Khrushchev Thaw. The acceptability of jazz music, however, continued to be a topic of debate among Soviet officials, including Khrushchev himself. When first exposed to jazz music, he remarked, "I don't like jazz. When I hear jazz, it's as if I had gas on the stomach." The Soviet public, though, showed overwhelming support and appreciation for domestic jazz musicians. As the popularity of jazz rose in Soviet territories and communist countries, America's musically knit message of unity and freedom continued to circulate within close Soviet communities. Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was the first to propose a federal program that would use jazz music as a medium of foreign cultural exchange. A preacher-turned-representative for New York's 22nd Congressional District, Powell had built a strong public following as a national Democratic spokesperson as he advocated along Martin Luther King Jr. for civil reforms and federal assistance for the poor. As the spread of Soviet propaganda increased in the post-war years, Powell in 1955 made a direct appeal to Eisenhower's State Department, suggesting the federal government assist in sending jazz musicians as ambassadors to individual Soviet republics. Powell had strong familial and congressional connections with the African-American jazz community and advocated for the use of America's indigenous art form as a tool for global diplomacy. With the backing of Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, Powell was able to secure the planning and funding for a musical tour of the politically volatile Balkan Peninsula and the Middle East, rocked by revolutions in Cyprus and Egypt only a few years prior. The man for this mission, bebop trailblazer Dizzy Gillespie, had been personally consulted by Powell over his potential involvement in the federal sponsorship, and by early 1956, he had arranged a band of several talented artists, including a woman, trombonist Melba Liston, to join him on his tour. During a period spanning March and April of the same year, the band would play at such venues as Damascus, Syria, and Beirut, Lebanon, making their way as far east as Karachi, Pakistan. An American ambassador who had gone on the trip reported that, "Maybe we could have built a new tank for the cost of this tour, but you can't get as much goodwill out of a tank as you can out of Dizzy Gillespie." Gillespie's epic showing was met with immediate acclaim from both domestic and foreign media and civilian interests. While Powell's plan met staunch congressional opposition from segregationist lawmakers unwilling to present an African-American art form as official U.S. foreign policy, New York Times reporters in Turkey and Lebanon described Gillespie's tour as nothing short of a hit that would really stay in the theater walls for a long time to come. As amazed as the concertgoers were by the sound of American jazz, they were equally as awed and intrigued by Liston, whose participation in each event was free and unrestricted. Gillespie's band also directly interacted with their audience, adopting and embracing the cultural traditions of the locale before making their move to the next Middle Eastern state. By the time the musicians returned home in May, both Congress and the State Department had seen enough of Gillespie's success to recognize music's capability in securing the friendship of potential Communist bloc allies. President Kennedy would sign the Fulbright-Hays Act into effect in 1961, officially incorporating jazz ambassadorship as an arm of U.S. cultural and educational diplomacy. Over the decade of the 60s, more prominent jazz artists would be added as ambassadors to the State Department's official list, and the program would expand to become more than just a tour operation. On the federally sponsored Voice of America Jazz Hour program, hosted by promoter Willis Conover, American talents and their bands were brought into the homes of the Soviet people by smooth-sounding radio broadcast. In the communist world, American jazz heroes continued making their way through Eastern Europe and Asia, becoming household names in the process. Artists like Louis Armstrong and Benny Goodman came to promote the American values that would shield the world from nuclear terror. By 1968, America had largely concluded most of its touring of Europe, Africa, and Asia. In the nations jazz had come to set foot in, the 1960s was a decade of cultural renaissance, in which indigenous social and cultural elements blended with American jazz. While jazz ambassadors themselves were not of all the same race or color, government acceptance of jazz, music of African American origin, discredited Soviet claims of hypocrisy and racist practice. Citizens in Soviet socialist republics like Georgia immediately adopted jazz as their own, hosting annual concerts like the Tbilisi Jazz Festival that have come to represent full liberal victory over the Soviets' cultural bans. Outside of the Soviet Union, jazz made its name in war-torn regions that could any moment fall to communist influence. During the 1960 to 1965 Congo crisis, as the Soviet-supported Republic of the Congo found itself fighting against the seceding Katanga and South Kasai provinces, Louis Armstrong arrived in the capital city of Leopoldville as part of a state-sponsored African tour to promote American business interests. Prompting a ceasefire between rivaling forces so each could hear him play, Armstrong displayed the captivating interest of unity-speaking jazz to war-ravaged peoples. Jazz also fundamentally changed the practice of diplomacy. Gillespie's success in 1956 served as a basis for further peaceful connection, both official and private, between the United States and the Soviet Union. In 1958, American piano prodigy Van Cliburn was awarded first place by Khrushchev himself at the inaugural International Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow, outplaying his Russian competition and striking down the Soviet claim to Cold War cultural superiority. Only 15 years later, Richard Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger would launch the Détente program, using the close cultural connections and mutual understanding developed by jazz ambassadorship to base a number of key disarmament agreements. Such developments were critical in working towards Cold War peace. In April of 2021, Secretary of State Antony J. Blinken attested to the vitality of cultural integration to U.S. foreign policy when he emphasized that America's arts and culture had the power to change the minds of those who misunderstand us and tell the American story in a way no policy or speech ever could. An ongoing project, Jazz Diplomacy has continued to share America's message with the world. It has played a vital role in garnering support for world peace and promoting democratic ideals. Jazz Diplomacy, a revolutionary incorporation to America's cultural program, truly changed America's approach to Cold War negotiations with the Soviet Union in a musical way.